Hey guys, what's up? What's going on? How you doing? And welcome to today's video. So real quick, today's video is about basic dashboard gauges that you may find yourself looking at when driving your car. So we're going to look at the different gauges, their purposes, how they function, and how to interpret them. But before we get started, if you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. That is if you wish to have more of this content. And if you find the content helpful, please feel free to drop a like for us. It helps us with morale. It gives us more morale to record more videos of this kind. So without wasting much time, let's get started with our video. Starting off to the right, we have this gauge over here that goes from 0 all the way to 8. That gauge is known as the RPM gauge or the rev counter. The purpose of the RPM gauge is to indicate to you, the driver, the current engine work rate. For those of you that do not know, engine work rate is measured in revolutions per minute, abbreviated as RPMs. So if you look at this gauge, the way to tell this gauge apart from other gauges in the car, if you look at it, it has that marking X 1000R/min to mean that any value that the needle is pointing at multiplied by 1000 revolutions per minute to get your current engine work rate. Currently, the needle in this gauge is at 0, as you may see there. Why? Because the engine of my vehicle is not running. However, once you start the engine, the needle in this gauge will get off 0 and settle around there. They usually start off from there. Then as the engine warms up, the needle drops to around there. It depends on the vehicle. Why are the revs always high on startup? It's because the engine is still cold and it's still warming up. After the engine warms up to operating temperature, the revs drop back to around there. Secondly, if you look at this gauge, it has markings in white and markings in red. Why is it so? The markings in white are the safe operating zone for the engine over a prolonged period of time without risk of being subjected to excessive stress. So it means that the engine can operate within the white zone over a prolonged period of time. Then the red zone over there is the danger zone, where it is not recommended to operate the engine over a prolonged period of time. Operating the engine within the red zone over a prolonged period of time puts it under excessive stress, meaning that the engine components are undergoing fast wear and tear. So if you happen to be driving, it would be much advisable for you to keep the needle within the white markings. The needle in this gauge works hand in hand with the accelerator. When you press on the accelerator, the needle in this gauge will go up, and once you ease up on the accelerator, the needle in this gauge will come back down. So that is it for the first gauge. Next gauge for the day is this one over here that goes from 0 to 180. That is your speedometer. The purpose of the speedometer is to indicate to you, the driver, how fast you are going. Currently, I'm not moving, my vehicle is stationary. That's why the needle in this gauge is at 0. So for this gauge, when you start accelerating and picking up speed, the needle goes from 0 all the way to this side, depending on how hard you're accelerating. And when you slow down, the needle in this gauge also goes back that side. So the next thing that I'm talking about is, how do we interpret, how do we read this gauge to know that we are going, let's say 30, we are going, let's say 40. So we are going to use an interval-based setting. If you look at this scale that has been provided, we have a common difference of 20. We have already posted speeds, 20, 40 all the way to 180, but from one speed to another, we have a common difference of 20. So I'm going to use 60 and 40 to calculate the common difference. So the common difference between 60 and 40 is 20. But how many slashes do we have to go from 40 to get to 60? That's what we are going to count. Count with me, please. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4. So to go from 40 to 60, I have to go through 4 slashes, or 4 marks. So the common difference that was 20 divided by the 4 slashes, the answer should be 5. So let us try to work that back onto this scale and see what we get. So if this is 40, if we add 5, that marking should be 45. That should be 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80. So it means that our answer is correct. If you've not understood, please feel free to rewind the video and look specifically at that part. Next that I'm talking about for this gauge is the markings that come with the gauge. How do you differentiate it from other gauges in the car? If you look at this gauge, it has a marking of km/h to mean kilometers per hour. However, there are some vehicles that have mph. It depends on the vehicle. km/h represents kilometers per hour, while mph represents miles per hour. Those two units of speed are not equivalent. For example, if you, let's say, convert 30 miles per hour into kilometers per hour, you will get something like 48.3 kilometers per hour from miles per hour. So it shows you that there is that big difference. Those two are not the same. So this brings me to the next bit for this gauge, especially for people that are going to buy their first car. In Uganda, speed limits are strictly dictated in kilometers per hour, km/h or kph. So when you're going to the car dealership to buy your car, it is much advisable for you to look at the units of speed for the speedometer. Buy a car that is calibrated in kilometers per hour and drive it in a country where speed limits are dictated in kilometers per hour. Buy a car that is calibrated in miles per hour and drive it in a country where speed limits are dictated in miles per hour. So in Uganda, speed limits are dictated in kilometers per hour. That's why our speedometers are calibrated in km/h. So that is it for the speedometer. I hope it is clear. The third gauge for the day is this one over here that has F and E. The F and E gauge is known as your fuel gauge. The fuel gauge is featured by any vehicle that has an internal combustion engine. An internal combustion engine is one engine that runs on petrol or diesel fuel. If your vehicle runs on any of those two, you must have this gauge in your car. Its purpose is to indicate to you, the driver, how much fuel you have left in your gas tank. How much fuel you have left. You track that using this. If you look at this gauge, it is always marked by that symbol over there, the fuel pump icon that I'm currently lasing. So a quick rundown for this gauge. That over there is empty, that is quarter, that is half, that is 3/4 full, and that is full all the way to the max. Then it also has an additional marking. Some fuel gauges have an additional marking as fuel door and that arrow or that marking over there. So the purpose of this marking, additional marking, is to indicate to you, the driver, the location of your fuel tank opening. So for this vehicle, it is pointing to the right, meaning that the fuel tank opening for this car is to my right. If I'm to go to the fueling station to refuel this car with petrol, then I will have to line up the fuel tank opening, which is to my right, on the same side as the fueling nozzle, such that I can have petrol pumped into my gas tank. So that is it. Next gauge to talk about is the temperature gauge that has the H and the C markings. So the temperature gauge, unlike other gauges, is marked by that symbol over there. And the next thing to know is that not all cars have a temperature gauge. Some vehicles feature it like this one, while others do not feature it. The purpose of the temperature gauge is to indicate to you, the driver, the current engine operating temperature. How hot is your engine running? We track that using the temperature gauge. That's why it has the H marking for hot and the C marking for cold. If the engine has not been started as it is now, the needle will always point at the C marking to mean that the engine is cold. Once the engine is started and it gradually warms up, or as it warms up, the needle in this gauge will keep moving along the scale and settle around there, slightly below half. So the needles in most temperature gauges for the cars I've driven always settle around there, slightly below half. That is where they usually settle to indicate the normal operating temperature of the engine. For whatever case, if you're driving and you notice that the needle in your temperature gauge is going past half all the way within this side up, then it means that your vehicle has a problem with overheating. It is much advisable to go to your trusted mechanic to zero down the problem as to why your vehicle is overheating. For vehicles that do not feature a temperature gauge, when the engine is cold, a dashboard sign similar to that will light up but in blue. Then, once the engine warms up to operating temperature, the dashboard sign that is blue, similar to that, will turn off. And for vehicles, for the same vehicles that do not have a temperature gauge, if the engine is overheating, a dashboard sign similar to that will light up but in red. So that's the difference between vehicles that feature a temperature gauge and vehicles that do not feature a temperature gauge. So that is it for the temperature gauge. Next that I'm talking about for dashboard gauges is the gear shift display indicator right over there. So this is a digital gear shift display indicator, and its purpose is to indicate to you, the driver, the currently selected gear setting. So it is N because my transmission is in neutral position. So when I keep on changing, it is now in D, drive, that is 3, that is 2, all the way to 1. So I'm going back to P, just like that. So this is your gear shift display indicator. It indicates to you your currently selected gear setting over there. Next, for the dashboard gauges, I'm talking about the odometer. The odometer is a 6-digit value that indicates to you, the driver, the total distance that the vehicle has covered ever since its manufacture. So this right there is the odometer, 6 digits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way. So you track the total distance covered by your vehicle ever since its manufacture using that value over there. Unlike the trip meter, I'll talk about the trip meter in a while, the odometer is non-resettable. You cannot reset the odometer for whatever reasons. Once it starts counting, it keeps on counting all the way up. It does not count backwards. No, you cannot reset this. So if you see a bigger value on the odometer, it means that the vehicle has moved for quite some time, usually above 100,000 kilometers. That vehicle has moved. But if the vehicle is having less than 100,000 kilometers, then that vehicle has moved a smaller distance, or it has moved but not that much. The smaller the value, the lesser the distance covered by the vehicle, and the bigger the value on the odometer, the more the distance covered by the vehicle. It means that that vehicle has been driven for some time or for a while. Lastly, for dashboard gauges is the trip meter right there. Now this that you see is a digital trip meter. There are some kinds or some vehicles that feature an analog trip meter. For vehicles that have an analog trip meter, it is usually a 4-digit value, 3 numbers in black and 1 in white. But this is a fully digital trip meter. So the purpose of the trip meter is to indicate to you, the driver, the total distance covered by the car on a given trip. For example, let's say you want to know the total distance from Kampala to Entebbe International Airport. So what you do, you reset the trip meter back to 0. You start driving. When you get to Entebbe, then the value that you see here over there is the total distance from Kampala to Entebbe. So unlike the odometer, the trip meter is resettable, and we reset it using this protruding dial over there. So for vehicles that feature analog style of trip meters, you usually have to press this once and let it go. But for this one, you have to press it twice. You have to press and hold the button down. So it's similar to this. You press, you hold in, it goes back to 00. That is trip B. So if I want trip A, I press again, then it goes back to trip A, and then I press and hold down, then it goes back to 00. So after driving from my starting point to my ending point, what I see over there is the total distance from my starting point to my ending point of the journey. So that is it for dashboard gauges. I hope you've learned something new. Please, if you feel that the content has been helpful to you, that the video has been educative to you, please drop a like. And that's it for today's video. I'll see you guys in the next video. All the best. Bye bye.